I didn't get heat exhaustion or heat stroke, but I definitely got really uncomfortably hot by the end. That was after 5 days of constant exercise, and I was tenting also. I was camping out, so I had no indoor shelter. I was just out in the sun kind of for 5 days straight. And then the last day of riding home, I definitely, definitely felt it. So that was probably my single hottest experience overall.
Welcome to the Canadian Cycling Magazine podcast. I'm Matthew Pioro, and with me is Matt Hansen. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you for having me once again.
Always. Wouldn't miss it. Wouldn't miss a moment to have you. Well, I have. Anyway, welcome back. It's good to see you, Matt.
Good to see you as well. It's been quite a long time.
Yeah, maybe 24 hours. Matt, it's hot. It's getting hotter. It's really hot.
Uncomfortably hot, you might even say.
It felt like we had a cool spring, but at least where we live, the heat is here, and I think there's more heat coming to most parts of Canada. So, in this episode, listeners, you will find out all you need to know about riding in the heat. I speak with Stephen Cheung, professor and senior research fellow at the Department of Kinesiology at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. He's worked with many top cyclists and athletes in other disciplines to prepare them for racing in hot conditions. He has tons of tips and advice for riding when the temperatures are rising. But before my chat with Stephen, Matt, let's briefly touch on some racing news.
You're talking about professional races, not local races, I'm guessing, right?
Correct.
Oh, okay. So it's not about me. Gotcha. Okay.
Listeners have absolutely no interest in your races, and
You do?
neither do I.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Tour de Suisse recently concluded with Adam Yates of UAE Team Emirates winning, and UAE Team Emirates looked crazy strong with teammate João Almeida second overall and with 2 stage wins to his name.
I know, like they need to be even stronger with that Slovenian fellow. It's, a bit of a super squad.
Well, the Slovenian fellow, as you have so coyly referred to, is Tadej Pogačar. The lineup seems pretty much settled. Pogačar discussed it on someone else's podcast, but it looks very strong. And yeah, I think it has other teams concerned about just what kind of firepower those guys are bringing.
Nice to see Egan Bernal up there again in the mix. He's slowly getting back to, I think he was 4th overall. So it was nice to see him in the mix again, like the old days.
Definitely.
Hell of a comeback.
When the last pod of ours came out, it was in the midst of the Criterium de Dauphiné, so we did not mention Mr. Derek G and his success of winning the 3rd stage of that race. And I would say that race was not just for Canadian fans. It was an exciting race overall, kind of a nail-biter right up into the end as into how the GC would shake down.
Yeah, that last stage, I mean, Jorgensen almost like he's going to steal the jersey off of Roglic's back, so... that was a great finale.
That was Matteo Jorgensen of Visma Lease Bike. He seems to really be performing well at the week-long stage races. He won Paris-Nice. So again, I'm not sure if he's on the Tour de France or if he's headed to the Tour de France, if he's on the squad there. But yeah, he's having a great season.
And to see Derek G hang on his wheel until almost the end, it's phenomenal.
Exactly. Now, Derek G's team, Israel Premier Tech, has not officially announced its lineup. It seems there's a very good chance G is going, and it also looks like Hugo Uhl will be on the start line there. This would be, if Hugo Uhl lines up for this tour, this would be his 6th Tour de France in a row, and of course, remember, he won a stage in 2022. Matt, who is Alex Volstad?
She is... someone to watch, I would say. She had a 3rd place at the Junior Tour of Flanders in the spring. And what's interesting is that was basically her first time at what we call a classic style race. She's 18. She's from Calgary. She's originally a mountain biker, which might explain why she really likes the cobbles and the tough, punchy climbs. But it was a phenomenal result if you think about, that level of racing. And yeah, someone to watch for sure. She races for a Dutch team, and she's going to be doing the nationals, defending her national road race championship. But I think she has bigger goals, world championship kind of stuff. So yeah, another exciting young Canadian.
Her team is Watersley R&D Road Team, and the Holmgren sisters, Ava and Isabella, were on that last year, or worked with that team last year for road racing. So that's an interesting club or squad to watch for sure. And yeah, it's exciting to see Alex Volstad getting that result at the Tour of Flanders. And I'm just looking at her stats here. She's got a few podiums at, well, races I've never heard of in Belgium and the Netherlands. But no, it's looking good.
I say all these Canadians doing well is just really annoying. I keep saying this. It's just, just more reports, more work.
More work for you. Yeah. Yeah. It must really be difficult.
Can we get back to finishing 50th or something, 60th?
Is that Canadians racing abroad at the top levels, or are we talking about your races again?
Honey, I thought we weren't talking about my races.
That's what I was hoping. Matt, another race you've been watching is the venerable Tour de Beauce, this Quebec racing institution, which just had its 36th edition this year. Give us an idea of what happened on the roads of the Beauce region this June.
Well, the funny thing, actually, one thing I noticed was that, and I joked to you that climate change is real because normally it'll be 25 degrees in the rest of Quebec, and then it'll be 5 degrees and raining usually. And this year it was warm. They did get rain on the Mégantic day, but not the kind of deluge that, we're used to seeing. One Canadian took a win of a stage as Michael Foley from Hustle Pro Cycling, but ultimately it was actually a New Zealander, Josh Burnett, who took the overall. And the last stage looked, the last stage you're doing St. George there, and it's a tough circuit race. And like something like 40 guys DNF'd. I mean, of course, if you're not in the mix on a final stage, you're going to pack it in anyways, but it looked like another tough 5 days of racing.
Finally, mountain biking, cross country. Last episode, we had Isabella Holmgren on, and she continues to race very, very well. This past weekend, the World Cup in Val di Sole, Italy wrapped up, and the Lidl Trek rider crushed the under-23 Exio event. And this time, it was on a very slippery course, so that's just fabulous news and fabulous racing.
More results by Canadians. Just more results. More work.
This episode of the Canadian Cycling Magazine podcast is supported by MS Bike. And with the release of this episode, summer is officially here. Summer means prime riding season. You should make an MS Bike event part of it. There are rides in 7 provinces, all with support that includes food, drinks, roadside help, and first aid. If you didn't do as much riding as you had hoped to do this past spring, don't worry. There's still time to get prepared for the MS Bike rides. If you're looking to do the event in Gimli, Manitoba, or the one from Ottawa to Brockville in Ontario, there's just enough time to do the MS Bike 8-week training plan, which you can find on our website. Did you know that more than 90,000 Canadians live with MS? You can help. Give your riding some focus and some purpose. Head to msbike.ca. Register and start fundraising. All right, Matt, let us not wait any longer, and we'll get to my conversation with Stephen Cheung. As I mentioned off the top, it's got lots of great advice that all riders can use for riding in the heat. I think I mentioned this to you. He did say something that I thought was hilarious that pertains directly to you and me. Well, maybe me, because he mentioned how when a rider is pedaling their bike, there's not only the watts that are being measured in their pedals, but there's also all this other energy, power being wasted as heat. And it's a lot. The number I can't remember the exact number he threw around, but I was like, I wonder if there's any way to capture that heat and put it back into my pedals.
I'm listening.
Well, so far, this is just science fiction, though, as I'm trying to figure out how to get faster than you. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, well, keep working at it. Maybe you can come up with something.
Thanks, man. Thanks for the encouragement.
Dare to dream.
Anyway, while I brainstorm fantastic ways of keeping up with Matt Hansen, let's listen to my interview with Stephen Cheung for actual, real advice that all of us can use for riding in the heat. Stephen Cheung, welcome to the Canadian Cycling Magazine podcast.
I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to our chat.
Well, let's talk about the weather. It's June. It's summer. Where you are in St. Catharines, where you're a professor and senior research fellow in the Department of Kinesiology at Brock University, where you are, the weather is pretty great today, mostly sunny, low 20s, I think. But recently, Environment and Climate Change Canada delivered its summer seasonal forecast. It looks like things will be hot, or at least most of the country will experience above average temperatures. These temperatures will be mostly seen in the north, across most of Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces. Now, we don't know about how many heat waves that'll mean or what temperatures we'll face exactly, but we know things will be more than normal. Now, all of this brings us to the subject of our talk. Stephen, you have studied the effects of environmental stress, which includes heat, on human physiology and performance. You've contributed to Canadian Cycling Magazine in various articles throughout the years. Today, I want to help listeners understand heat and its effects on their rides and what they can do about it. But before we get into those details, can you tell me how you became interested in the subject of environmental stress and the body?
Sure. Well, I guess it all started with bike racing. When I was an undergrad at University of British Columbia in the 1980s, I really got into cycling and road racing. My degree was actually in oceanography. It had nothing to do with humans or exercise. But after I decided to go back to grad school, I wanted to have something with a personal interest. Ideally, I want to make myself faster on a bike. And so I did a master's in kinesiology, and it was really my master's advisor at Simon Fraser who got me literally into environmental physiology, as in within 2 weeks of my being in the lab, he had me in his cold tank undergoing mild hypothermia. So that hooked me. And the whole idea of how the body responds to environmental stress of heat and cold and altitude really became a passion for me. And that's guided my direction in research for almost 35 years now.
Oh my gosh, you wanted to get faster and you got thrown into a cold tank without a bike at that.
That's correct. Yeah. And then I've done a lot of heat studies. After my master's, I switched to a PhD at University of Toronto, working with the military lab in Toronto. And we did a lot of work looking at soldiers exercising in the extreme heat, wearing chemical warfare clothing. So I run the gamut from looking at extreme cold to looking at extreme heat. And the ultimate goal is, besides understanding how the body works, is also to help improve human performance for athletes, for workers, and also just for safety for the general population.
Well, let's turn to cycling. Let's imagine a hot ride. Let's say it's 29 degrees Celsius and humid, maybe a humidex of 32. What's going on in my body as I ride? And let's also say I'm keeping things zone 2 so I can carry on a conversation as I'm riding.
Sure. So the main thing to keep in mind is there is a difference between a warm and dry or a hot and dry environment like we might have early in the summer in Ontario, and a warm and really humid environment like we might have later in the summer in Ontario. So first off, what happens in the heat? Well, when you are exercising, you are generating a lot of heat. And most people are vaguely aware of it, but maybe it doesn't really hit home. When you are exercising, let's say you are riding at 200 watts. So that is the mechanical power you're putting into your pedals. But to generate that 200 watts of mechanical power, you are also generating about 800 watts of heat. So your body is only 20% efficient or so. So any mechanical power, there's a lot more heat being generated. And so your body has to get rid of the heat. That happens whether you're in a cool environment or in a hot environment. The challenge when you're in a hot environment is now it makes it a lot harder for your body to get rid of all of that extra heat because the environment is hot, right? So if your body temperature is already 37 degrees, but the air temperature is, let's say, 35 degrees, well, it becomes really, really hard to transfer the heat from your body to the environment because there's really little difference between your body temperature and the outside environment. So that's an additional challenge. Now, when you throw in humidity, the other way the body gets rid of heat, besides just moving it to the environment, is sweating. So you sweat, you create a film of water on your skin, and then your body heats it up, and that water on your skin, that sweat evaporates into the environment and helps you get rid of heat. That's all works really well if it's a hot and dry environment. But if it's a hot and humid environment, now the air is really saturated with water already. So it's not really allowing any of the sweat you produce to evaporate. So it's just dripping off of you. That's why a hot and humid environment is way, way more difficult to exercise in than a hot and dry environment because you really have no way of removing the heat. It's not transferring to the environment and you can't sweat and evaporate the sweat. So be really careful to consider the weather. It's not just about the air temperature, it's also about the humidity, which is why in Canada we have the humidex value, which tries to give you one central number to think of to talk about overall heat stress.
When we speak about cyclists, we think of different abilities, like some are natural climbers, some are natural sprinters, some are good at time trials. Are different athletes naturally better at dealing with heat? And if so, what is it about those bodies that are good with dealing with heat?
Well, there's a few reasons why some individuals are better at getting rid of heat or tolerating hot environments than others. One is certainly fitness. We know if you are fit, you tend to have a stronger sweat response. And so that's going to help. You also tend to have more blood volume. So that helps move heat away from your core and out to the skin and to the environment. So we know fitness helps. We also know if you heat adapt, you are going to be even better. And we'll talk more about heat adaptation coming up. So those are two big things. The other thing is generally smaller individuals, smaller, lighter individuals are probably in general going to be better able to handle heat because they can get rid of the heat better than a really large individual. Because a large individual is also going to have much more muscle mass and much more body mass to move. And therefore, they're going to be generating a lot more power and also a lot more heat as a result. So, yeah, I would say fitness is one key thing to be better prepared for the heat. Heat adaptation is another. And then one thing we can't really change is our body size. And generally, smaller individuals tend to be better able to tolerate heat than really large individuals.
But I want to pick up on the idea of fitness and also how it relates possibly to sweat. If I get fitter, does that change the way I sweat, or do I always sweat the same?
Well, you tend to sweat more. For any kind of body temperature you're at, you will sweat more if you are fit. And also, as your body temperature increases, your sweating response is more sensitive. Let's say you're a non-fit individual and you might, for any kind of exercise, you might be sweating, let's say, 1 liter an hour. For the exact same kind of exercise for a fitter individual, you might be sweating 1.5 liters. That is much more effective because there is more water on your skin to evaporate. But of course, that becomes a challenge if you're in a humid environment because, again, the sweat is not necessarily evaporating from your body. It's just dripping off of you and getting you dehydrated faster. So going back to what I was talking about with my PhD, which was about soldiers exercising in extreme heat with chemical warfare clothing, that combination of clothing and the heat outside did not allow them to get rid of the sweat. So they could sweat a lot more, but it wasn't really helping them. So sweating is great, except for when it's not, when the environment doesn't allow that sweating to be a benefit.
Now, if I'm sweating 1.5 liters of water every hour, do I want to be trying to replace all that? Do I want to be chugging at least a liter of water an hour? Is that advisable?
You want to be continually drinking. A lot of it depends on how long you're going to exercise. If you are really only exercising an hour, some of the studies, including from my own lab, suggest that you don't actually need to drink at all. You can still be performing just as well in the heat, whether you are drinking during that hour of exercise or not. Now, again, other labs argue otherwise, but that was the finding of my lab and a few other studies. If you are just exercising for a short period of time, you don't have to obsess about drinking. If you are now doing a really long gravel race or doing a century ride, absolutely you need to drink. When you hear these arguments of do you need to drink or not, you have to really factor in how long you're going to be riding. So that's one of the key things. Now, how much you need to drink is another question. Again, a lot of it depends on how long you're exercising, how hard you're exercising, and how hot it is outside. The general guidelines suggest that you don't want to lose more than 2 to maybe 3% of your body weight. You want to keep that in mind. You want to be drinking a little bit. You don't necessarily have to, if you're losing a liter an hour, it's not as if you need to absolutely drink a liter an hour in response. It's also really hard to drink a lot of water. We're lucky on the bike, we can carry water, right? So it's pretty easy for us to carry water and to be drinking it. But yeah, you don't really need to obsess about drinking in terms of matching your fluid intake to how much you're sweating. You want to keep kind of somewhat close, but you don't have to be 100%. And then you really want to just drink the thirst. Your thirst is a pretty strong guide to how much you need to drink. And I know on a hot day, I don't necessarily try to match my fluid intake at all. I just drink the thirst, and usually it keeps me within that safe range.
So I want to get to heat adaptations and the specifics of adapting to the heat in a second. But how long does it usually take a rider to get used to or get better at riding in hot weather?
I would say probably a minimum of a week. Full adaptation can probably happen within about 2 weeks, but you can get much of the benefits after 1 week. That's kind of the general consensus. I've done a lot of kind of detailed meta-analyses of all of the heat adaptation studies, and that's kind of the general ballpark. You can get away with most of the benefits over 1 week. You can get pretty much full adaptation over 2 weeks, but the longer you can do it, the better.
I want to pick up on some work you did with Amber Neben, who went to the World Championships in Qatar in 2016. Can you tell me a bit about what her process of heat adaptation was like?
Sure. And just to set the stage, in 2016, again, the World Champs were in Qatar. It was, I think, at the end of October, but it was still incredibly hot in Qatar. Amber, who is a time trial specialist, she is based in Southern California, which is still warm, but not Qatar hot. And so her and her coach, Tim Cusick, wanted my assistance in helping to develop a heat adaptation strategy. So we had to be creative. And I think what we did have a lot of lessons for kind of your everyday cyclist, in that we didn't have access to my lab and the environmental chamber to really control the environment, the temperature, etc. So what did we do? Well, we started early, and we'll talk about the reasons for that later. But we started well ahead of the World Championships, about 8 weeks or so beforehand, and not kind of 2 weeks beforehand. And then we were really creative with what we did. We had her do a combination of rides outdoors with a lot of clothing on to increase her sweat rate, increase her kind of heat stress. We also had her do indoor training with, again, a lot of clothes with less fans going to, again, drive up the heat stress to really stimulate her heat response. And then the other thing that we did was we also combined it with, she had access to a sauna at home. After a lot of her rides, we had her go straight into the sauna. We had a cooler with her recovery drinks already right outside the door. She finished her ride, just went straight into the sauna with the recovery drinks and kept her temperature warm. Her body temperature was already high from riding. And then she just maintained that high heat stress for another half an hour or so with the sauna afterwards. So we did a lot of different things like that, of manipulating the amount of clothing she wore, the kind of training that she did, and also using things like sauna exposure to kind of increase the heat stress. But the overall goal of heat adaptation is really just to drive your core temperature up and keep it up for an extended period of time. That is how your body is stimulated to do things like have more blood volume, to have a stronger sweating response. It's just like training in a sense, right? If you train the body, you're adding stress to it. The body is responding to try to make it stronger by becoming fitter. The same thing happens when you expose yourself to heat. Your body is sensing this added heat stress, so it's going to become better at responding to heat.
So this preparation was 8 weeks long, and it makes sense because this was a serious goal event for the rider. But let's change gears a bit to, let's say, us average riders. Let's say we have a goal event this summer and we're expecting it to be pretty toasty on that day. And, I can't dedicate, if I'm speaking for myself, I can't dedicate that much time to getting my body ready for the heat. What are maybe the most important things that most of us can do to get ready for maybe a big gravel ride or a big race or a big fondo this summer?
Yeah, sure. So first off, the best thing you can do is to heat adapt. That is going to cause the biggest long-term changes that's going to benefit you. Now, we're probably all seen things like cooling vests. We see all the pros wear them before a time trial or even just before warming up on a mountain stage. We see things like these cool towels or neck collars that are supposed to help you cool down. We've seen athletes put ice cubes and stockings under their jerseys and things like that. Those all have a place, but they're really kind of your marginal gains. They're not kind of your big fitness gains. And that's what heat adaptation is. Heat adaptation is going to get you the best prepared for heat. And then you can layer on those additional day of things. But those little day of things aren't going to take the place of the heat adaptation. So, you do want the heat adapt. And again, one of the interesting things that came out of the 2016 World Champs in Qatar was a real survey of the athletes going and looking at their awareness of how heat affects their performance and also what heat adaptation strategies they did. And the biggest finding I found shocking was that only about 40% or so of the athletes actually heat adapted in any way at all. And this was for a race that is absolutely going to be guaranteed to be hot. So I just find that inexcusable. And we certainly saw instances where athletes underperformed because they weren't heat adapted there. So again, the first thing you can do, whether you're a recreational athlete or you're an elite athlete, is to heat adapt. Now, you certainly don't need 8 weeks of heat adaptation. What we did with Amber was we had about 3 to 4 weeks of heat adaptation, and then we just maintained kind of the heat adaptation with one session a week for the final 4 weeks. The reason is we want to be really proactive and start early because we didn't want the additional heat stress to impair her fine training kind of those final few critical weeks leading up to the world champs, right? So we got heat adapted early. And that's probably one of the lessons that everyday individuals can take. And we're in late June right now, but if your event is at the end of July or in August, you want to start heat adapting now, and then you can maintain it with just periodic doses coming up. So I would say that's your biggest message that we should be imparting. Now, again, we can take lessons from Amber in terms of how everyday individuals can heat adapt. Again, you can wear more clothing than you normally would. So you can really layer up clothing that's effective. You can also ride indoors with less fans than usual. And that's also going to drive your heat up. Heat adaptation doesn't have to be high tech. You can, almost all of us have easy access to these kind of guerrilla tactics for heat adaptation.
Is there a mental side to heat adaptation?
Oh, absolutely. There's absolutely a psychological component of dealing with the heat. And actually, this was done by my master's student, Phil Wallace, in a paper we published in 2017, where we looked at just using sports psychology to improve our tolerance in the heat. And what we did was we had two groups. We had them exercise in the heat beforehand, and then one group was just sent away to come back 2 weeks later, do your normal training and come back. The other group, in addition to doing their normal training, was given a really targeted sports psychology program, really dealing with psychologically improving their perception of heat stress and how they responded and reframed kind of their tolerance, their mental tolerance to heat. So at the end of the 2 weeks, both groups had no difference in their fitness. They were just as fit as before, but the amount of exercise that the sports psych group could do in the heat was just through the roof, like in terms of different from the control group. So despite no change in fitness, this sports psych by itself was able to significantly improve your exercise time in the heat. So absolutely, your perception of heat stress and your mental kind of coping strategies play a huge role in how you respond to heat.
Earlier, you mentioned that periodic work on heat adaptation can maintain adaptations that you've made, maybe under focused work. But let's say, this may be an overly simplified example, but let's say I go through a period and I'm riding through hot temperatures and I'm good, I'm comfortable, I'm performing well. But then, I don't know, it cools down for 2 weeks and I'm sort of just coasting on the heat adaptations I made earlier. How long can I coast on this heat fitness that I have?
The good news is, based on a limited number of studies that have looked at decay of heat adaptation, that rate is fairly slow. So you can keep the benefits for a good long time. And you can probably keep most of it going by just, let's say, one dose of heat training a week. So it's not like you have to expose yourself to heat repeatedly, in a cool environment. You can probably get by with about one session a week. So that was, again, what we did with Amber. We had her train in the heat and get her really heat adapted with about 5 to 6 weeks to go before Qatar, and then we just kind of coasted in a sense and just had her exposed to heat once a week after that, and that was hugely effective for her.
I'm wondering if there's any advantage, and this is more a question that I'm sure would affect pros, not so many Joes, but if there's any advantage to training in hot and then racing in cooler temperatures. I'm thinking of, say, Matthew van der Poel, who during the cyclocross season jets off to Spain and then comes back to Northern Europe to do the races. Granted, Spain in February is not Qatar, but there is, temperature changes there. And of course, he goes to Spain because it's just more comfortable and easier to train. But is the temperature difference, does it help? Is it the equivalent of like going to altitude and then coming to sea level, but temperature?
Yeah, and that's an interesting analogy. The literature is kind of mixed on whether heat training is going to be effective for exercising in cool environments. And there's probably about just as many studies that suggest yes, it is a benefit as studies that say no, there's no benefit at all. I'm kind of somewhat pragmatic in my approach is that, what we do know is that it doesn't hurt you. There's been no studies suggest being adapted to a hot environment is going to negatively impact your performance in a cool environment. So if that's the case, at worst, there's no effect. At best, there might be an effect, an improvement. So yeah, I would, if I was a pro, then I would certainly consider kind of through the bulk of my racing season being heat adapted. And then that's one less thing I have to worry about. I don't have to think, oh, like I am going to this one particular race where it might be hot, it might be cool. Do I take the gamble to be heat adapted? If you're already heat adapted, it's not, at worst case, it's not going to hurt your performance. At best, it might help. So if you can devote the time to it, why not?
Earlier, you mentioned ways of staying cool in the midst of a ride, like ice cubes or ice socks and all those ice vests and other tricks that pros use on race day. What are strategies for the rest of us that we could use to stay cool on a hot ride? And maybe just for example, like, is it worth dumping water on my head, or is it better to dump water on my back or squirt it on my chest? Where's the biggest bang for my buck in terms of getting me cool quickly?
Yeah, that's actually a question I like to ask my PhD students during their kind of big qualifying exams is if you had a liter of cold water, do you drink it or do you pour it over yourself? And I always find that an interesting question because in a sense, there's no right answer. But yes, I would say ideally you would do both. Ideally, you would both drink cold water and also pour cold water over yourself because the cold water that you drink, is going to make you feel better and it's going to rehydrate you. And, but also if you pour cool to cold water over your body, you're going to have a short-term cooling of your skin temperature. You're also, in essence, kind of doing the job of the sweat glands. You're putting water on your skin, and then ideally that water is getting evaporated. So I guess the ideal would be yes to both if you had the ability. And, again, it depends on the venue, right? For example, one of the races I love doing is the gravel ride Reggie Rambo, which is near Peterborough in mid-July. And the nice thing with that is it's different loops of a course, and you always come back to the same spot, and you can have all of your supplies there, right? So if that's the case, and especially on a hot day, you can plan ahead, have a cooler full of ice socks, and in each loop you can just go and throw a few more ice socks down your back or whatever. And so there are definitely strategies that you can incorporate. It really just depends on your kind of local conditions and the race conditions, right? So something like the Reggie Rambo where it comes back to the same place for aid stations and you can have essentially your drop bag there is perfect for something like that.
Ah, yes, the barn at the Reggie Ramble. I've definitely gone through there, and yep, resupplied. It's actually a great feature, and because you're your own soigneur at that point.
Yeah, just to add another point in terms of dealing with heat, the other important thing is make sure you have sunscreen, right? If you don't have sunscreen and you get sunburnt, well, that's actual skin damage. And now your blood flow to the skin is not as good. And also your sweating is not going to be as good. So one of the absolute critical things to make sure of is make sure you use sunscreen and you periodically apply it if you can. So again, at Reggie Rambo at the barn, I would always have sunscreen there and spray myself or add sunscreen at every loop. But if you don't have that, another simple thing you can do for a long ride is I've also just used the contact lens cases and just fill it up with sunscreen. Super easy to slip into your pocket or in your handlebar bag, and it's a perfect amount for another application or two.
I love that tip. And in fact, you've mentioned it in the pages of the magazine, and I've since taken that up. I have a contact container with some sunscreen in it. I'm careful not to mix it up with my other contact containers. But it's also great for traveling too. And then I know I'm definitely not trying to bring a big sunscreen tube on the plane accidentally. So yeah, that is definitely a pro tip. And I find it interesting because we are much more aware of the danger of sunburns, but in terms of that connection to skin health and staying cool and also performing better on the bike, that is just another dimension that I don't think is well known. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
No, absolutely. Burn victims, they can't thermal regulate, right? Because again, their skin is so damaged that the blood flow is bad there, and also all their sweat glands are burnt off. So that's kind of what we're doing if we don't use sunscreen and get sunburned to a much smaller extent, but it's the same kind of idea.
Are there any seemingly counterintuitive methods for keeping cool? I'm thinking I've read numerous articles about having a hot drink. Maybe some tea can actually help cool you down on a hot day. Not that I want to put hot tea in my water bottle, but should I have that Americano at the mid-ride stop on a hot day?
The Americano is probably going to do you good just for the caffeine charge, so I wouldn't worry about that. Yeah, there's not too many things that are counterintuitive. One thing is, whether you should be having that Americano or having that caffeine shot in the heat. And because the idea is that caffeine is a diuretic and that it's gonna make you, lose more fluid through urine. Most of the time, we're exercising so much that it's not going to be a big effect. And if you are just drinking kind of espressos where there's a lot of caffeine in a very small volume, then you're getting very concentrated caffeine. But most of the time, a caffeine gel or anything like that, or a shot of caffeine is not really going to affect your heat tolerance as you're exercising. So I wouldn't worry about that. No, definitely don't go with the hot tea thinking that it's going to be a thermal regulatory advantage. That doesn't work. That just is going to heat you up. It's not going to cause you to sweat more or anything like that. And yeah, I can't really think of too many things that are counterintuitive. One thing I would say is, if you are heat adapting, the other reason we want to heat adapt well ahead of time is just to remember that heat stress is an additional stress on your body. So there is some literature suggesting that you can't get optimal heat adaptation and physical training at the same time. And because the heat stress is an extra stress on your body, so you're not recovering as well. So that's another reason why you want to heat adapt in a sense as early in the season as possible, not just kind of 2 weeks before your main race in the heat. And in the kind of the endurance building phase of your program, rather than, okay, I got to make every single interval session count because I only have 2 weeks to go kind of time of the year.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. Heat adaptation is kind of like endurance. You can't cram train and get her in just before the event. You do have to give it that time.
Yeah, just to remember again, it also does impact your training. You just can't train as effectively when it's hot out. You go for a time trial and you're going to be riding at a lower power output in the heat. So you're going to have less kind of actual training stimulus because you just can't exercise as hard. And also you can't recover as well because you're hot. So, it's definitely something you can't really cram and kind of optimize with physical training at the same time.
Often air quality gets worse as the temperature rises. What should a cyclist consider when looking at air quality?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's getting to be more and more of a reality with wildfires. And that's going to impair your training also. And especially if you have asthma, if you have breathing issues, but even if you don't, it's going to affect you. The other challenge with the heat in summertime is that smog is generally higher because smog is really a combination of heat and pollution that causes increase in ozone and increase in pollution. So that's another reason why summertime can be really challenging for a lot of athletes. It's not just the heat stress, it's also the increase in pollution. And now, thanks to climate change, we also have a lot more wildfires to worry about too. So absolutely don't underestimate that. The air pollution can be a whole separate kind of podcast topic, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be something we can really adapt to. It's certainly not like, oh, let's go expose ourselves to pollution and that's going to kind of improve our tolerance to it down the line. That doesn't seem to be the case.
I almost feel like I shouldn't ask this question because of as we're coming out of the pandemic and it's probably triggering to some people, but should I wear a mask as I do an easy ride?
If you're going to be in a very polluted environment, I would certainly consider it. And because what you are really trying to do is block those big particles, those major pollutant particles from getting into your lungs. Remember, the other thing that happens is as you start exercising, you rely less on breathing through your nose and more breathing through your mouth. All the hairs in our nose and stuff has a reason for being there. It is to help filter out some of the particles. So if we start just breathing through our mouth more, then there is a less filtering. And also as we exercise, we tend to breathe deeper. So all those pollutants get deeper into our lungs too. So yeah, it's a bad combination. The combination of pollution, which tends to be higher in summertime, and also the fact that we're exercising and breathing more and deeper and drawing those particles deeper into our lungs.
Will you get on the trainer when it's when the air quality is bad out?
Yeah, I would absolutely consider not going out when it's the middle of a pollution warning, whether it's wildfire or just high smog. I would consider exercising in a indoor environment, obviously with the caveat that the air indoors is filtered of some kind. If you're essentially just breathing outdoor air indoors, it's not really any different than being outdoors in a way. So you want to ideally be in a filtered air environment where you can get rid of a lot of the pollution and the large particles. Yeah, but if it's a wildfire alert day, I wouldn't be going out and exercising, certainly not at a really, really high intensity. And I would consider either having a rest day or doing an easier ride indoors.
Should I wear a base layer when it's really hot out? Or should I just have my jersey? Should that be only one layer on my upper body?
Sure. Well, let's consider what a kind of a tech type of jersey, whether it's cycling or just an athletic top, what is that doing? What it's really doing is wicking the sweat just off of your skin layer a little bit to increase the comfort, because wet skin is also very uncomfortable. So that's one of the things that, whether it's a base layer or a jersey, is doing. It's drawing the moisture just that little bit off your skin to improve comfort. And then the other thing it's doing is spreading the moisture over a larger surface area. So rather than kind of one drop, like a one really wet spot on your skin, it is kind of dissipating it and spreading it, let's say, over the back. So that's true of what a base layer does. It's true of what a jersey does. So, in the summertime when it's really hot out, you don't need a base layer, because if you have a good wicking jersey anyways, it's doing that same job of removing the sweat directly from your skin and spreading out the sweat. So no, if it's warm, I wouldn't be wearing an extra base layer underneath.
Is there any specific properties or features I should be looking at when choosing a summer jersey? Every brand says their jersey wicks away sweat very well, and I mean, most of them do, but is there any feature that I should be looking out for when I'm choosing a jersey?
I guess it's always a balance. Yes, almost all modern jerseys are very good at wicking away sweat. So I don't think one necessarily does it better than the other. What you really want to consider is how much ventilation of a jersey matters to you. And if you really like kind of more ventilation, then go for it. But usually ventilation comes at the cost of UV protection. So I think we've all remember that classic social media picture of Chris Froome a number of years back and one of their new training jerseys or the race jerseys, and he had a massive sunburn on underneath. And because the jersey was so ventilated that there wasn't much UV protection. That's probably something to consider. I wouldn't say any jersey is better than another nowadays in terms of sweat removal or wicking. Really comes down to how much ventilation kind of matters to you. But again, generally, the more ventilated it is, the less UV protection. So you got to keep an eye out for that. You might need sunscreen on underneath your jersey too.
Stephen, what's the hottest ride you've ever done?
Hottest ride? It was probably a couple of years back I was stupid enough to decide to go on a big bikepacking adventure where I bikepacked up to Mansfield in Ontario to do a gravel race. So I did a 2-day bikepacking trip, hauling all of my gear and everything up to Mansfield. And then I did the Eager Beaver gravel race. And then I spent 2 days riding home afterwards. And that was in the midst of summertime heat and humidity in Southern Ontario. And I definitely remember the last day I was pretty much at my wit's end riding home, and I didn't get heat exhaustion or heat stroke, but I definitely got really uncomfortably hot by the end. That was after 5 days of constant exercise, and I was tenting also. I was camping out, so I had no indoor shelter. I was just out in the sun kind of for 5 days straight. And then the last day of riding home, I definitely felt it. So that was probably my single hottest experience overall at the end of 5 days of this.
Oh my gosh, that does sound like a scorcher. Is there anything you would do differently or that you took away from that other than maybe avoiding a heat wave? What was your teachable moment out of that one?
What was my teachable moment? Was not the bike pack to a gravel race, probably. No, it was entertaining, but Brock here, we pride ourselves on experiential learning, right? And for an environmental physiologist, that was probably going to be my ironic death, to either die from heat stroke or from hypothermia. So I was open to it.
Oh my gosh. Expert in environmental stresses, heal thyself.
Yeah, if you write it down, it's science, right?
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that story with us, and thank you for sharing all that information about heat adaptation as we, riders, all of us, get ready for the heat of summer. Thanks very much, Stephen.
You're very welcome, Matt.
And that's the episode. It is written and edited by me, Matthew Piaro. I had help from Matt Hansen. Thank you, Matt.
And what an episode it was.
I also had help from mountain biking editor Terry McCall. This episode of the Canadian Cycling Magazine podcast is produced by Adam Killick. He does the music, too. Also, thank you to Ontario Creates for its support. I think I'm still a bit sore, Matt, from our ride that we had on the weekend. Finally, it's June, and we finally went out riding together.
We did. Yeah, that was fun. And with Andre.
Yes, listeners might remember Andre Cheung from recent episode about Shimano's GRX. It was like 3 Canadian cycling staff in one ride. This, for some odd reason, oddly enough, this doesn't happen that often.
Spotted in the wild, one might say.
Also, we went early, partly because of my weekend dad schedule, but also so no one would see the bike I'm riding.
All right, that's a big secret. So I shouldn't say it out loud right now, should I? It's
No, we'd have to bleep it. Yeah, we can't. Listeners might be able to figure it out for themselves, but no, we agreed with the maker of this bike not to mention it, so we will do that.
Well, it looked very fast.
Yeah. Actually, it is. It's a fantastic bike, but man, you guys are fit. Holy jumping! I thought I'd be in a good position with you, slightly tenderized from a big ride the day before, and Andre, he's he said he was a bit tired, but man, you guys are fast.
Well, I had those Aero socks on, so that's probably what did it.
I think so.
And the Aero gloves too.
Right. If only I was as well prepared as you were. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening. Ride safely, and we'll talk to you later.